The Silent Shadow. Part 1. The Discovery. The Pinos Negros forest had always been part of our community, a place where generations of children played and explored. I, Daniel Mendez, a nature photographer, never believed in the legends that the village elders told. Stories about a tall, thin figure lurking among the trees, watching, waiting. They were just tales to keep children away from the forest at night, or so I thought. It all started when I found an old camera abandoned during one of my photo expeditions. It was partially buried under fallen leaves as if someone had tried to hide it. The camera was old, probably from the 1990s, but the film was still inside. Curiosity got the better of me and I decided to develop the photos. The first few images were normal: forest landscapes, wildflowers, a meandering stream. But the fifth photo paralyzed me. It showed a group of children playing near the old oak tree, and in the background, barely visible between the trees, a long black silhouette. It could have been a blur on the film, but something about the shape, too tall, too thin, made me shiver. The sixth photo was similar, but the figure was closer. The seventh was even closer. In the eighth, one of the children seemed to be looking directly at the figure. And in the ninth, there were no children. Just the empty forest. The last photo was blurry, as if taken in motion. Only a black mass that seemed to envelop the camera could be distinguished. And a pale arm too long to be human. Part 2. The Investigation. I investigated the camera in the village. No one remembered who it belonged to until I spoke to Elena, the librarian. Her face paled when I showed her the photos. "Those children, they disappeared 25 years ago," she murmured. "My brother Carlos was among them. 5 children went into the woods one summer evening. None returned." Elena told me that after months of fruitless searching, some people in the town began to talk about Slenderman, a supernatural entity that kidnapped children, a patient predator that first watched, then stalked, and finally took. No one believed those stories, Elena explained, until other children began drawing a tall, thin man in their notebooks. Children who had never heard the legend. She showed me the local newspaper archives. The drawings were eerily similar: an extremely tall figure, disproportionately long arms, dressed in black, and most disturbingly, no face. That night, looking through the photos again, I noticed something I had missed. I enlarged the image of the child looking up at the figure. His eyes showed no fear but fascination. And in his hand he held a paper with a drawing. A drawing of the same being that watched him from the trees. Part 3. The Signs. I began documenting the legend, interviewing village elders and looking through historical archives. I discovered that the disappearances had not started 25 years ago. They dated back to the founding of the village in 1879. Each generation lost some of its children under mysterious circumstances. And there were always earlier signs: unexplained headaches, recurring nightmares, and drawings. Always the drawings of the slender figure. A week after finding the camera, I began experiencing intense migraines. I attributed them to the stress of the investigation, until I woke up one morning to find a drawing on my desk. A forest of pine trees, and among them, a tall, thin figure. I didn't remember drawing it. The nightmares began that same night. In them, I walked through the woods while feeling a presence following me. I could never see it directly. It was always in my peripheral vision, disappearing when I tried to focus on it. Elena noticed my deterioration. "You must stop this," she warned me. "It's happening again. When you look for him, he finds you." I ignored her. I was too fixated on uncovering the truth. Part 4. The Sighting. 3 weeks after the camera was found, I was reviewing the footage from my last expedition into the woods when I saw him. I hadn't noticed anything unusual during the footage, but there he was in one frame, partially hidden behind a tree about 30 meters away, an impossibly tall and thin figure. The video had captured only his black suit and a waxy pale hand, with fingers too long to be human. I reviewed the next frame. The figure had disappeared. That night, I decided to face my fears. I returned to the woods with my camera and a flashlight. The air was unusually still, without the usual sound of nocturnal insects. Just silence. I walked to the clearing where I had found the old camera. The moonlight filtering through the branches created eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Then I felt it. That unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, pointing the flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. I took a few steps forward, and the beam caught something white in the vegetation. I approached cautiously. It was a page torn from a notebook, pinned to a trunk with what looked like a rusty nail. On it, a child's drawing, the silhouette of a tall man next to several trees, and a sentence written in shaky handwriting: "You can't escape." As I examined the paper, my flashlight began to flicker. I tapped the device trying to steady the light when I felt the air grow colder. My breath formed little clouds of steam in front of my face. And then I saw it between two ancient pines, a motionless figure so tall that his head almost touched the low branches. He was dressed in a crisp black suit that contrasted with the eerie paleness of his hands. And his face, where there should have been a face, there was only a smooth porcelain white surface. I froze, unable to run or scream. The figure didn't move, but I felt like it was analyzing me, studying me like a predator assesses its prey. My flashlight went out completely. Part 5, The Chase. In the pitch black, instinct finally overcame fear. I ran. I ran like never before, tripping over roots and low branches, guided only by the pale moonlight that barely penetrated the dense foliage. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. I heard no footsteps chasing me, only an unnatural silence that seemed to move with me, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. When I finally spotted the lights of the village through the trees, I allowed myself to look over my shoulder. The road behind me was empty. But as I looked back ahead, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, just a few feet away, motionless as a black marble statue. How had he gotten in front of me? It was impossible. From his shoulders emerged what seemed to be tentacles or extra limbs, black like his suit, reaching out like living shadows. He had no mouth, but I felt him smiling. I closed my eyes, preparing for the worst. But when I opened them, he was gone again. I arrived home panting, covered in cold sweat. I locked doors and windows, turned on all the lights. For hours I sat in my living room, staring at the door, waiting. Dawn broke without incident. When the first rays of sunlight came through the windows, I allowed myself to relax a little. Maybe it had all been a product of fear and suggestion. Maybe. Then I looked at the recording on my camera. The video showed my frantic run through the forest, my labored breathing a soundtrack to terror. But what made my blood run cold was what the lens captured. Every time I looked ahead, nothing. But when the camera pointed at the ground or to the sides, there he was, following me. Always at the same distance. As if he were playing with me. Part 6, The Symbols. Elena came to see me after I failed to show up for our scheduled meeting. Her expression changed at the sight of me, bloodshot eyes, several days' growth of beard, a messy apartment filled with drawings I didn't remember making, all showing the same slender figure. I showed her the video. As we watched, she grew progressively paler. "There's something I didn't tell you," she finally confessed. "After my brother and the other children disappeared, I started having dreams. In them, Carlos showed me a symbol, a circle with an X through it. He told me to draw it on the doors and windows. Elena showed me an old book of local folklore. In it, an entity known by different names over the centuries was described. Der Grossmann in German texts, Le Faucheur Elance in French chronicles, and among the Native Americans who originally inhabited these lands, simply he who lurks in the trees. According to the book, the crossed circle symbol functioned as a seal of protection. That night, we drew the symbol at each entrance to my house. Elena insisted on staying, she didn't want to leave me alone. At midnight, the electricity failed. The candles we had prepared as a precaution cast dancing shadows on the walls. We waited in silence, listening. The first sound was almost imperceptible, a light scratch on the living room window. Then another on the back door. Then on the ceiling. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, as if absorbing the candlelight. Elena whispered, "He's testing the defenses." The scratching continued for hours, moving methodically through every possible entrance. Occasionally we saw a shadow pass in front of the windows, too tall, too thin to be human. At dawn the sound ceased. The symbols had worked, at least for that night. Part 7, The Revelation. The next morning we found marks at all the entrances, long, deep scratches that no human tool could have caused. The symbols were intact, but they seemed fainter, as if they had lost power. "They won't last another night," Elena said. "We need to find a permanent solution." We went back to the archives. If this entity had stalked the town for generations, there must be something else in the historical record. We found it in the journals of the town's founder, Geronimo Vasquez. He described how Native Americans warned him about building near the Black Pine Forest, considered sacred land and a prison for an ancient evil. According to legend, the entity had been confined to the forest by a ritual involving 5 stones carved with special symbols, placed at specific points forming a pentagon around the forest. Geronimo dismissed the warnings as pagan superstitions. He ordered the stones to be removed to make use of the land. The disappearances began that same year. We examined old maps and located the spots where the stones should be. 3 had been destroyed during the expansion of the town, but 2 might still be in their original place. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, we found the first stone in an abandoned lot. It was partially buried, but the symbol, similar to the cross circle but more complex, was still visible. The second stone was in the local cemetery, repurposed as part of an ancient mausoleum. Elena proposed a plan: recreate the 3 missing stones and place them in their original positions before nightfall. We worked against the clock, carving the symbols into similar stones according to the designs in Geronimo's journals. By the time we placed the last stone in position, the sun had already set. Part 8. The Confrontation. We returned to my house, hoping the restored pentagon would contain the entity in the woods. The symbols on the doors and windows seemed brighter now, as if they had regained their power. At midnight the storm began. Lightning flashed intermittently across the room as the wind howled like a wounded beast. "It's not working," Elena whispered, staring out the window into the woods. "Something's not right." A particularly intense flash of lightning revealed a silhouette in the garden. Motionless in the pouring rain, its black suit perfectly dry despite the downpour, the figure watched us. It had no eyes, but we felt its piercing gaze. "The stones?" I muttered. "They must be in the wrong order." Another flash of lightning and the figure was closer to the house. Its arms, too long, almost touched the ground. Dark appendages emerged from its back, writhing like solidified smoke. "The journals mentioned a specific order," Elena said, frantically flipping through the pages. "Based on the lunar phases during the equinox." As we were looking through the papers, we heard a creaking sound. The symbols on the front door were beginning to fade, like ink under water. "I found it," Elena exclaimed. "The cemetery stone should be at the east point, not the south." We had to get out, reposition the stones correctly. But he was outside waiting. "I'll go," I decided. "You keep the symbols alive, reinforce them." Before Elena could protest, I threw open the door and ran to my car. The rain hit me like tiny, icy needles. I didn't look back, but I felt its presence getting closer. I arrived at the cemetery in record time. The storm had reached biblical proportions, lightning striking so often it felt like daylight. As I dug up the stone to move it, I felt the air grow thicker, colder. Looking up, I saw it among the tombstones. Its limbs stretched out like living shadows, wrapping themselves around the tombstones. "It's not real," I screamed to myself. "It's fear manifested. It can't touch you if you don't let it." But when one of its appendages touched a nearby tombstone, it cracked as if it had been struck by an invisible mallet. It was very real. With a final effort, I placed the stone in its correct position. The carved symbol began to glow with its own light, a bluish glow contrasting with the white lightning. The figure stopped. The appendages slowly retracted. One by one, the other 4 points of the pentagon began to glow in the distance, connecting by lines of light that ran across the ground. A high-pitched sound, like a distant but omnipresent scream, filled the air. The figure twisted impossibly, as if sucked into the forest by an invisible force. And then, silence. The storm subsided as suddenly as it had begun. Final part, the aftermath. It's been 3 months since that night. The black pine forest remains silent, the stones in their positions, watched regularly by Elena and me. The nightmares have lessened, though I occasionally dream of him. In those dreams, he's confined to the central clearing of the forest, but he watches me. He waits. He knows time is on his side. The stones will erode eventually. People will forget. They always do. A week ago, I found a drawing in the library. A child had left it in the children's section. A forest of pines, and among them, barely visible, a thin, faceless figure. Elena and I have begun documenting everything we know about him. How to recognize the signs of his presence, how to protect ourselves, how to keep him confined. Because we know this isn't over. He is patient. He has waited centuries. And he will continue to wait. Last night I dreamed of the forest clearing again. He was there, motionless as ever. But this time he bowed his faceless head slightly as if greeting me. And for the first time I heard his voice in my mind. It wasn't monstrous or terrifying. It was soft, reasonable, almost kind. "The stones are weakening," he said. "And when they fall, I'll be waiting for you. You and all who know my name." The end.